Um, we're talking city transformation, and I think it's so vital for us to understand that when we talk transformation, we are not necessarily... Oh, let me just go back to this. We are not necessarily talking about a political agenda where we want to try and take over the world and engage in a way in which we would come in the same spirit. Many times we see Christians getting all excited about engaging their world, and many times they engage with exactly the same fleshly spirit that is currently manipulating and controlling in many areas of our world. When Jesus sent the disciples, He said, "I send you as lambs amongst wolves." And really what He was saying is, I send you in the power of the opposite spirit, of the Holy Spirit. When you engage an environment where there's greed, go with generosity. Where there is a selfish, self-centered environment, go with serving and giving. Where there's bitterness, go with forgiveness. Where there's hate, go with love. Go in the power of the opposite spirit. And in the power of the opposite spirit, you break the controlling spirit. Because many times we come into areas where, the same spirit of greed is manifested by the church instead of coming in the power of the opposite spirit. But it's coming with great intentionality. And this is what Paul says when he reflects in the Taylor translation, says it so beautifully. It says, "I run straight to the goal with purpose in every step. I fight to win. I'm not just shadow boxing or playing around." And so, what I want to share with you this afternoon is something of the intentionality that we sense as a ministry, wanting to engage our community and wanting to trust God that the dominant influence within our city and the cities where we are involved will manifest something of the lordship of Jesus Christ within the context of our community. And I can truly say that in the 20 years that we have been in Pretoria, South Africa, we have seen something of a culture shift where it's becoming an environment where it is now, I would say, challengingly vogue to be a Christian. Because that brings with it other challenges. But it's shifted so much that it's become an environment. We were just, prior to coming here, just having a lunch at a restaurant, and we were looking, just from our vantage point, 3 different places in the restaurant, people were having spiritual engagement, praying for their food, talking about Christ. It's become part and parcel of our environment. And so we've taken what we have established in Pretoria, South Africa, to other environments that are post-Christian environments and are now field testing some of these principles to see whether they are transferable and scalable within other environments. And we are so excited about the fact that we're seeing that they can be implemented in London, UK, in Stuttgart, Germany, and other places in the world. So I would like to share with you then, as I've mentioned at the chapel service, that we were deeply challenged by 5 key references that have become guiding lights and have helped us in our navigation of our journey to somehow be able to get a stronger foothold on a strategy. So the first thing that we've communicated is there needs to be a change of mentality. And let me just quickly say something about this again. Before we started doing anything, any action within our context, we realized that for it to be sustainable and not just a project that is an addendum to us as a church, we will have to change the very culture of our church. We will have to change the mentality of us as a church. Because many people, and still many people would come to us as a church, not because of our vision. They would join the church because they think it's a nice church to raise their kids because we have a good children's program. Or they like the worship. Or, they appreciate the word being communicated. So they would come for other reasons that are very consumer-related reasons. And then we have to take the people on a journey with us to integrate them into this missional understanding where they can understand that they actually are part of a dream and a vision and something that we're trusting God for within the context of our community. And I would safely say that we probably, if we had to boil it down to how many people are really missionally engaged, I would say we probably have at this stage about a 60% that we can say are really missionally orientated and engaged, and then there's still a 40% that's kind of journeying with us and they just like us because of our style or the culture or the whatever way that we engage church. So it's that tension that you try to facilitate as you navigate this way going forward. The second thing that we felt was very important was to clarify the strategy. Now, here's what happened after Jesus said to the disciples, we're going to give them something to eat. Jesus then says to the disciples, go and break up this group of 5,000 men into groups of 50s and 100s. Now, that must have been a pretty challenging exercise. The disciples, not being trained in crowd control, now suddenly have to go down and get this group into smaller groups. And you can imagine, just think for a moment, these are hungry people. They've been in the sun all day. There has to be some kids running around and being irritated. All of that taken into account, it was still important for Jesus to get them into smaller groups. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us why, but I think Jesus knew that if he wanted to monitor the outcome of this miracle, whether every person was fed, he would have to implement some kind of a strategic process, a grid, so that it could be measurable, so that he could somehow understand and see that every person was fed. And many times in the church, I find this tension with leaders that when you talk about strategy and organizational design and positioning, it's as if there's a nervousness within the context of the church where we feel, somehow we should not go down that route. And I want to share with you today that I think it is absolutely imperative that you deeply consider strategic reference so that you can prepare for the miraculous that can take place. Now, in this particular environment, we realized a few things in terms of our strategy. First of all, we realized that we will not be able to do this alone. And that part of our strategy will be to somehow create a network of relational consensus within the broader life-giving expression of the body of Christ in our city. And so we gave a lot of our time to facilitate that process in our city. So right up to this day, we have relationship with 12 key leaders in the city. It just so happened that we gave an invite to some key leaders in the city, got together about 14 years ago, and that led to us becoming friends. And what we do now is once a year, we actually go on a retreat together with our spouses, and we would have a day or two where we would sleep over and just share life together, and then pray for the city together, and then also ask questions about the next season of engagement in terms of the city. As a matter of fact, just 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, we were on this retreat for this year, praying about next year. And part of our strategy that we left with there as these key leaders was, next year, we're going to trust God that every school in our area, every public school, private school in our area will have some connection with spiritual engagement in our city. And we made a commitment to that. The second one was that we will have a deeper, unified process to serve the orphan crisis in our city. And so now we, as key leaders in the city, have embraced that. And now we have a whole system in which we will cascade that to the rest of the city. And by the beginning of next year, the city will embrace this as part and parcel of their engagement, because we that have relationship as key leaders in the city will be leaning into our spheres of influence and bringing these people into that understanding so that we can mobilize actually our whole city because of friendship being so deep and so committed. And we're from different streams, very different streams theologically, but we've become friends, and everybody in the city knows that. And so anything that happens in the city is now kind of, we've become spontaneous elders of the gates of the city because we felt that that was extremely important. At the same time, we also realized that as a ministry, we would want to have campuses all over the city. And so we started establishing these campuses in the city, which we rolled out as being one church having different campuses all over the city. Now, we started in 1994, and you have to understand, in 1994, there were very little of multi-site, multi-campus kind of ministry was happening across the world. There was nothing like that in South Africa. And I remember me and 3 of our leaders getting on a plane, coming to the USA to hear and see what was happening here. Because everything good starts here, right? So we came on the plane, and I remember going to the West Coast to Jack Hayford's church and looking at what they were doing. They had at that stage 4 campuses in one street in Van Nuys in California. And he had a big cable that was running down the street that was doing technology. I think he was the first guy to experiment with technology at that stage. We knew that was not going to work for us. And so we looked at other models here. We found Paul Walker with the church in Atlanta, Mount Paran. They had Mount Paran Central and North, about 30 miles from each other. It was a fascinating model because Paul would preach here, and then they'd start singing at the other campus. And then as soon as he's finished, he'd jump into the chopper and fly over just in time as they landed the worship to come in there. And he started speaking. Then they'd start singing this side again. And as he finished up there, he would be back in the chopper and going back this way. And he did that 4 times. And I liked that model because I saw my own chopper. Doxa 1. But somehow we were challenged not to go down that route. And somebody that really influenced us at that stage in his thinking was Randy Pope, who had the Perimeter Church in Atlanta. And they at that stage had 7 campuses around the city. And so we took that model and re-engaged how it would fit within our own context. And so we've established 11 campuses. But here's what's unique. These 11 campuses form one local church. So it's one eldership of the city that has campus pastors being dedicated to different campuses of the city. But we share resources together. So everybody puts money into one pot. Now, in the South African context, that's huge because of the disparity that we have. There is huge affluence, and then there's dire poverty. And now, everyone has the same expenditure budget. So whatever they spend in the affluent area, they would be able to spend in the challenging area. And so what has happened is we've been able to put down campuses in challenging environments without them being implicated by their environment. And that has given us traction in many of those environments. But you can imagine that calls for a consensus, collaboration, a constant sharing of the vision so that everybody understands we're looking at this from a city perspective, not just from a local perspective. What this has also done is this has challenged us to consider how we engage with our people. And so I just referenced that quickly at the chapel service, that we think of our people now no longer as people coming to a program, but they become the program. So we look at our people from the perspective that we are trusting God, that when they leave the church, they leave it as being commissioned, as being sent. So if there is a teacher in the church, we would now commission them and send them and say that if you leave here, you go and represent the conviction of this family of faith in that space. And you become the Adam of God, and that's your garden. You've got to God intended. And when you experience moments of grace, we want to harvest those stories. We want to hear about them so that when we present the family news on a Sunday, it's not just about the events that are going to come in the next week, and we're not just going to celebrate some of the activities of the church. We are celebrating the activities through the church. So we want those stories up there so that everybody can see that that's what we mean. And actually, some of them are so simple but so profound, and people sit in the audience and look at it and say, but I can do that. So that's what you mean. And now we're creating culture. People are starting to get it by understanding that they're part of this process. Now, for this to happen, we've said that we commit ourselves to train city changers. That's what we call our people, city changers. And we will develop them on 3 primary dimensions. And these dimensions are the 3 concepts that I've referenced: to surrender, to serve, and to subdue. And literally what that implies is surrender is about knowing God and your relationship with God. Serving is engaging in a spirit of service to people. And subduing is going beyond that to trust God for the transformation of the construct of our village, of our society. And so we have in our environment the following banners that are different in every different campus, as they would then see the artwork to be fit. So in London, it would look different to the inner city of Pretoria, which would look different to the student community that we serve. But the concepts stay the same. And what we say to our people is, you would be able to measure your own growth by measuring the passion quotient in your life. Now, let me just quickly say this. The word passion comes from the Latin word passere, which literally means to suffer. The passion of the Christ is the suffering of the Christ. And I've learned that people are only prepared to suffer for the things that they really believe in. Somebody just invited me to go fishing with them recently. And we had to do 5 fishing and get into the river. And when I woke up early in the morning, we were supposed to leave. I pulled back the curtains, and I saw that it was a lousy day outside. It was just raining, and it was bad. And so I got back into bed. And a few minutes later, he was at the door saying, "Alan, are you ready?" I said, "Did you see the weather?" And it was like, "Yeah, but it's okay. We're going fishing." I just thought to myself, it's amazing what people are prepared to suffer for if they're convinced of it. Now, this is what we teach our people, is that we want you to understand this is taking you on a journey. But we want you to measure in your own life your surrender quotient in terms of your passion for God and your passion for integrity. These are the two things. If you're growing in a passion for God, passionate about your relationship with God, and a passion for integrity in life, you know that you're growing in this particular area. Secondly, if you're growing in your passion for people and your passion to serve, in other words, that you realize your relationship with God is not just about you, but it's now also through you, that you can be an instrument of grace. If you're growing in these two passions, you're growing in the kingdom activity of serving. Now, what we found is the church has done very well up to this point. But it's the next level. Because here's what we found. Many times when we talk transformation or reaching your community, most Christian thinking goes towards benevolence, goes towards touching the poor and the needy. And that's good and that's right. It's fundamental to being church. But there's another level that wants to go beyond just reaching the pain of the city. It's going to the place where you could actually engage on the very construct of the city. Who determines what arts and media and education and government will look like within the context of the city? And so we ask that question very deeply, and we say, we want you to grow in a passion, and that's our metro in Pretoria called Tshwane, and a passion for the nations. And so we say to people, we want to stir these passions in your life, and that means that we have campuses where we will equip you for that to happen. And in the campuses, we will have two environments, primary environments. There will be groups and there will be gatherings. Now, simply put, gatherings are places of impartation and groups are places of transformation. So really, the gatherings are the places where the primary gifts of the church will impart things into your life, but it's in the groups where you will find opportunity to process and to engage. And so we challenge people to get involved in these two environments. And then we challenge them and say, now we want you to engage in the spheres of society. Now, in 1994, very few people were actually talking about spheres of society. And so we asked the question, what does our world look like? And we found 8 different components to our society at that stage. We now hear people speaking about 7 mountains and domains. And we didn't know there's only 7, so we found 8. But they've served us well. And really what this is as you will see there are 2 languages on every banner because our primary home language is Afrikaans. And just to say, South Africa is such a complex world. We have 11 official languages, of which only English is the non-indigenous language that is recognized as an official language. So you can just imagine just the complexity of our world. And so we talk about church and arts and media and social society and sport and education and business and government. And so we ask that question consistently: how do we engage in these different environments? And so we have this very simple little strategy that we call mobilizing, and on this one it still says infiltration. We had to change that. When we started our engagement in Germany, the people in Germany said, infiltration is not a good word in Germany. And so we said, help us then. What other concept will we use? And so they helped us to define it as engagement. And so right now we talk about mobilization, engagement, and modeling. And let me quickly explain to you what we mean by that. When we talk about mobilization, we're talking about looking at every individual in the church as a city changer. And asking the question, how can we more effectively equip you? In other words, not just bring you to the church to bless you, encourage you, but equip you. And that shifts you fundamentally from a pastoral paradigm to something of an apostolic paradigm of how you think about church and how you think about your people and how you engage the people. Of course, there will always be the restorative part. There will always be the pastoral part. But you've got to take it beyond that component to the mobilization engagement. And so we ask this question, how can we effectively empower people in different environments to be more effective? And then secondly, the engaging part. That's where we as the church say, how can we more effectively engage the space of education, of the arts, of certain aspects of our environment? One of the beautiful stories that a mutual friend of Mac and myself, Roger Sutton, just shared very recently is they're in Manchester, and his wife is an artist. And they're struggling to make inroads into their community. And then she got this brilliant idea. Because really the art galleries in Europe have become the new temples of reflection. That's where people go and sit and meditate and consider and think about life and hope for inspiration in terms of life. And so they spend a lot of time in their art galleries. And she got this idea, what if we went to the different art galleries in our environment and asked them if over Easter they would just create some space for an exhibition about Easter and get some local artists to prepare their art to put into that particular environment, and then create something of a pilgrimage that would be put on paper, and people could actually take it and go from station to station in the different galleries and just consider Easter. And the galleries became so excited about that, and I think they signed up something like 11 galleries, and so they went to Christian artists and said, would you prepare art and communicate something of your understanding of Easter? And the most amazing thing happened. The attendance over Easter in the galleries just shot up, where people were actually going to different spaces in that environment. You see, it's asking the question, how can we engage our community? How can we affect our community more substantially? And so we've spent a lot of time specifically in the area of education, where we've asked the question, how can we engage this? And as you've just heard, next year we will be mapping out our whole city with spiritual engagement. Right now we're involved, just as a ministry, we're involved in over 80 different schools in our city where we have a permanent engagement spiritually with those environments. I'm talking state schools. As a matter of fact, we now sponsor 45 youth workers full-time from the church to work in the schools. And we pay for them And we've put them in those schools. And as much as the school allows us to engage, we engage by just serving that community. You cannot imagine what that has done for our voice within the context of our community. So we've set up a whole office that's called TREE, Transforming Educational Environments, and that is just focusing on how can we access educational environments and play a role in serving our community in a more sensible way. And then the third level is modeling, and that's where we have our own schools. And so when we have our own schools, it's not like we want to create a school where we want to distance ourselves from the community. Rather, we're putting up a school and we're saying we want to take hands with a greater educational environment in our city, but we're asking this question: how can we demonstrate kingdom education in a way that will become attractive to the rest of our environment? And I wish I had time just to tell you about the victories that we've had in that environment. So we've gone and put down something that has become an attractive reference to our community. Just one thing, we decided that we will try and be ahead of the pack, not just on Christ-centered education, but also on technology. And so our high school became the first high school in our nation where the whole high school, all the kids were having all their curriculum on tablet. Now, you could imagine, in South Africa, that's massive. And that gave us just an ear within our community. And so people are talking to us. And now we find access to be able to engage our community in a very, very interesting and relevant way. The next, after you've clarified the strategy, is engage with expectancy. Now, here's very interesting in Mark chapter 6, the story. Jesus, when he breaks the bread and blesses it and the fish, he doesn't break it and build a whole reserve behind him so that the disciples can feel really secure. You know, at least now reserve matches need. He doesn't do that. He breaks the bread and the fish and he puts it in the hands of the disciples. And then he looks at the disciples and he says, "Go feed my people." Now, folks, just think for a moment. We read biblical stories and we think it was easy. Just think for a moment. Here that disciple is standing with this little piece of bread and fish. And Jesus says, "Go feed these people." And he's looking at it, looking at Jesus, looking at the people. Now, I can just see how he goes to a group of 100 and then decide, let's rather start with a group of 50. I see him breaking that first piece. I guarantee you, the first piece was a small piece. Why? Because he's a smart disciple. This stuff's got to last. And as he's breaking the pieces, there's the discovery that the grace of God is with us. And so we've started to teach our people the principle of engaging with expectancy. Just start breaking the pieces. Just start breaking the pieces. I wish we had time to tell you just some of these stories and how they've expounded, but our time is catching us, so I'm going to rush through this. The fourth one is allow for progressive expansion. Now, this is what happened to us. We now have a vision for 12 cities across the world. Because as we were reflecting on that portion of Scripture, we one day were confronted with this understanding that they picked up 12 baskets. And they took these 12 baskets to other places. And now they were blessing others with what they had received. And so we were challenged with that to take what we've been blessed with in Pretoria now to other places in the world. And if we count Denver in, we've just engaged in our 10th city. And then lastly, bless you. Go beyond with strategic partnerships. Here's what I will end with. Just as they finish feeding the 5,000, Jesus looks at them and he says to the disciples, go over to the other side. Now, they didn't want to go to the other side because you've got to understand the other side was the heathen side. It was where the 7 nations of Canaan had settled. It was the place where a good Jew did not go because they were the pig-eating people. But it wasn't the first time Jesus sends them to the other side. You remember in Mark chapter 4, Jesus says to them, we're going over to the other side. They don't understand why they're going, but the rabbi said they should go, but they're superstitious. They have this omen. Something bad can happen to us because we're going to the other side. Jesus goes and sleeps, and the storm comes up, but now this is a storm different to any other storm. That's why when they wake up Jesus, they accuse him and say, do you not care that we perish? Why are you taking us to the other side? And Jesus calms the storm. Of course, they get to the other side. There's nobody there to meet them. Nobody wants to engage them because the Jews didn't mix with these people. And there's only one man that's around there, and he's full of demons. And Jesus says to the disciples, that's our guy. Well, they get hold of him. They drive out the demons. There's the mass suicide of the pigs. It ruins the economy. The people come and chase Jesus away. They get into the boat. The disciples are just pleased to go. But this man that has just been delivered asks the question. He says, can I go with? And Jesus says, no. I always felt so sorry for him. But Jesus was so smart. Jesus knew he had just found the key to that whole region. And Jesus does something totally out of character because normally he said to people, don't tell anybody what I've done. To this man, he says, go and tell your story. Every village, every town, go and tell the story. And then they go away. Now, Mark chapter 6, they just fed the 5,000. I mean, they're still gung-ho about the miracle that's just taken place. Jesus says, go over to the other side. And we know the story. Jesus doesn't go with them. He sits up on the mountain, keeps his eye on them. They're getting concerned because the wind and the waves are picking up. Jesus comes walking on the water. They're expecting the worst. It's a ghost. Jesus has to save Peter because he spoils the program. And so they get to the other side. All right, now they're getting on to the other side. Go read what happens. 4,000 people gather. Why? Because the rumor started running. The one that set the demoniac free is back. Jesus had found the key to a region that was actually closed to them as Jews. I'm convinced that the season we're in, God is giving His church keys to unlock spaces that previously were out of bounds. Previously, we thought we would not be able to access. He's giving us keys to engage our world. May God somehow, through this quick presentation, drop something into your heart that might be helpful in your own journey as you navigate the way forward. David says, this means question and answers, right? Okay, that means questions and answers. So I have to give you an opportunity to ask questions. Yes, my friend at the back.
Hello, thank you very much for your presentation. It's very encouraging. And thank you for the vision that you laid out. It's very inspiring. It's inspiring as well. My question is more like a beginning stage, like how to start and working toward that vision. I will say like 2 examples. Both are real. One is in one small village where those people, they are really willing to learn and to engage, but they don't have leaders who can teach them the Bible. Always they can do is to invite people from outside to come to teach them, but they really want. So in the long run, I would say recommend them to find some people to send them to seminary to be get trained. But what can they do now? This is how to start. And the other is like in Chinese context, where the Chinese government really doesn't want the churches get together, the leaders united together. It's the last thing they want to see. So it's very, very sensitive to them. If you really want to get together, have leadership meeting, they're going to come and arrest you or whatever. So how to do in this context? So thank you.
Well, let me try and answer the first question. On the second question, let me just say, I have no idea. I trust that somebody within that context will be able to better answer that. But the first question is, I think what is so important is just to start creating a culture of missional intentionality. People need to understand that they are not just saved and come to Christ to somehow be obsessed with their own personal journey in Christ, but that God also wants to do something through their lives, that they can be instruments of grace, that they can actually play a role in the kingdom environment. And I think there are two things that are very important to address, that we had to address. The first one was our very deep sense of dualism, where we've separated our spiritual life and our everyday life. And we've had to speak deeply to that because it's ingrained somehow in our culture that people can be very spiritual over the weekend, but the rest of the week they don't understand how to integrate their faith in every dimension of their life. So the whole dualism, the secular and spiritual divide that has come, we had to teach people deeply about that. And the second one that was very important for us was the division between the clergy and the laity, where people somehow thought that spiritual weight was only with the clergy, the informed ones. And so we've tried to break that down so that people can understand we all have a calling. It's expressed in different ways. And so just those two concepts are so fundamental to creating the culture of engagement. I realize that environments are so different, and even in our own context, you can imagine, just our own context, as I've mentioned, South Africa has such a disparity because we have extreme pockets of affluence, like many of cities in the world, but you can come into Johannesburg and Pretoria and you could think that you are somewhere in one of the top US cities in the world because it just feels that way. But travel 5 miles and you see the most devastating challenge. And so we've had to adapt a lot of our engagement to those different environments. And of course, in certain environments, you would be far more restorative in terms of the conditions of the people and the pain and the challenges of the people. And so our engagement in certain communities would look very different to the engagement in other communities. And that's the challenge for us. But we're trying to build synergy, bringing resource into certain environments. And you know what it's like when some people leave their comfort zone and get into another space, they change. And so the exposure of cross-cultural and cross-economic boundaries is very important for us in terms of what we do. But it's fundamental that every one of those communities understand the principles of missional engagement and calling. We're about to write a book. The question was, do we have it written down? You know, somehow we're not as smart as the Americans are. We take time before we write a book. And every time I come to the US, everybody's asking me, so where's the book? And I say, you know, I'm still cautious. You know, we're still working on this. We're still, but we've come very close. So there is a book now that we're going to write that will be titled Lambs Amongst Wolves. speaking about how do we engage culture and how do we affect that. But we have random notes that we can send out and some presentations. So if you're interested, you're more than welcome to talk to me. I can send that to you. There was another.
Thank you for coming today. I had a question as to the part of changing mentality. Now, in South Africa, when they went through apartheid and all that, how difficult was it within your church in the beginning for people who decided, you know, everything's changing, but I'm not going to change my opinion, this is how I feel, and that's it, but I still want to be part of your church? How difficult was it to make that transition to acknowledge the new reality on the ground?
That's a very good question. You know, it's difficult always to gauge where people are in times of change and transition. And thankful to God, most people have made significant changes. I think there's still a residue in a percentage of people's hearts that I'm not sure before Jesus comes, we will be able to change that. And somehow, many times, they endure some of that which we are engaging in more than they celebrate it. But I think that's part of the journey. And you know, when you make transitions, nothing is easy, because our nation has really changed. Remember, we had armed resistance, and then everything changes. And now suddenly those that had the armed resistance don't have anything else to fight for. And that's changed into criminal activity. So if you come to South Africa, you'll see high walls, razor wire, electric fences, because there's so much criminality now. So the culture has shifted. And to keep everybody excited about engaging a community that has now different dimensions to it that is not necessarily a positive experience, stays a problem and stays a challenge. And so here's what I think you're saying. The role of leadership, and this is what I say to my own pastors and to the people that we can influence. The role of leadership is vital in times of challenge, because we lead people and we bring people into spaces. And if we vacillate and if we are uncertain and if we don't commit to the things that we deeply know is kingdom reality, whether it's easy for us or not, we're in trouble. And we place our whole community at risk when we as leaders do not stand firm to the convictions that we have. So in essence, it's not easy, it's not simple, it's very complex. Let me just say this, it's very complex. I hear about the Hong Kong challenge, come visit us. It's very, very complex, but it calls for leadership that will stand firm and that will commit to charter a course.
Hi, Alan.
Yes.
Over here. Sorry.
Over there. Okay.
Over here. Quick question. You spoke earlier of city changers and about surrender, serve, and subdue, and you mentioned the surrender quotient. So I'm under the impression that there's some sort of way that you're measuring it. There's some sort of metric. You talk about the passion of God and the passion for integrity. How do you begin to understand where individuals are at? How do you begin to...
Thank you for that question. We are extremely intentional with this. And so we realized if we don't measure it, we won't be able to really understand if we're moving forward. So we were fortunate in that one of the professors at the University of Pretoria was in our church, part of the statistical research department. And we started engaging him about how do you measure these elements. And so they made that a project. And they have now designed a measuring instrument for us where we are trying to measure the development of our people. And just to say, we have various measuring instruments that we use, but this is one of them that we will use to, so it's by way of a questionnaire. Once a year, we take half of a Sunday service that drives some people crazy too, because we ask them to fill in a questionnaire, and we extract information, and then it's a fascinating reference. So if you're interested in that, I can let you have that, and you can even see how some of that pans out in its measurements.